killed 77 people. Most of them children. And tonight, he's in his private apartment with a PlayStation, a personal gym, and a kitchen where he can cook his own meals. This is Anders Breivik's life inside Norway's Halden prison. But here's the question that's dividing the world in 2026. Is this justice, or is this the most sophisticated psychological torture chamber ever built? Tonight, we're going inside the $100,000 prisoner. The science, the secrets, and the shadow of Norwegian justice. Stay with me because what you think you know about luxury prisons is only half the story. Let's start with a number that will make your blood boil. $125,000. That's how much it costs the Norwegian government to house one prisoner for 1 year. To put that in perspective, that's more than what most American families earn in an entire year. That's more than a full scholarship to Harvard. And that's the price tag on keeping someone like Anders Breivik alive and comfortable. But before you close this video in disgust, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about being soft on crime. This is a story about a psychological experiment that's been running for over 40 years, and the results are so shocking that they're forcing us to question everything we thought we knew about punishment, justice, and the human mind. Let me take you back to July 22, 2011. It's a warm summer afternoon in Oslo, Norway. Anders Breivik, a 32-year-old Norwegian man, parks a van outside the government headquarters. Inside that van is a fertilizer bomb weighing nearly 2,000 pounds. At 3:25 p.m., the bomb detonates. 8 people die in the explosion. The blast is so powerful it shatters windows half a mile away. But Breivik isn't done. While emergency services rush to the bombing site, he's already driving 25 miles northwest to the island of Utøya. He's wearing a homemade police uniform. He's carrying a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. On that island there's a summer camp. 564 teenagers are attending a political youth event. These are kids, mostly between 14 and 18 years old, learning about democracy and social justice. Breivik arrives at the island at 5:17 p.m. He tells the camp leaders he's there for security reasons because of the Oslo bombing. They let him in. And then, for the next 72 minutes, he hunts them. He shoots children as they try to swim away from the island. He shoots them as they hide behind rocks. He calls out to survivors, pretending to be police, and shoots them when they emerge. When it's finally over, 69 people are dead on that island. 33 of them are under the age of 18. The youngest victim is 14 years old. This is not a theoretical debate about criminal justice. This is about a man who systematically murdered 77 human beings, most of them children, in the name of a hateful ideology. And now, in 2026, he lives in what many people call the most comfortable prison on earth. Here's where the story gets complicated. Because the moment Breivik was arrested, Norway faced a crisis that went beyond grief and rage. They faced a philosophical crisis that struck at the heart of their entire justice system. You see, Norway doesn't have life sentences the way we understand them. Their maximum sentence, even for crimes against humanity, is 21 years. When Breivik went to trial in 2012, the Norwegian people had to watch as their legal system struggled to fit the worst massacre in their modern history into a framework designed for rehabilitation. The trial lasted 10 weeks. Breivik showed no remorse. He gave a Nazi salute in the courtroom. He called his victims traitors. He said he would do it again. And at the end of those 10 weeks, the court sentenced him to 21 years in preventative detention, with the possibility of extension. That legal term, preventative detention, is something we need to understand because it's the secret loophole that changes everything. But we'll come back to that. First, I want you to see where Breivik ended up. Because this is where your instinct and your intellect are going to go to war. Breivik was initially sent to Ila prison, a high-security facility outside Oslo. But in 2013 he was transferred to a section that would become the center of a global controversy. His cell, or as the Norwegians call it, his unit, consists of 3 rooms. There's a bedroom with a regular bed, not a prison cot. There's an exercise room with workout equipment. There's a study with a desk, a typewriter, he's not allowed internet access, and a television. The walls are painted soft colors. There's art hanging in the hallway. Natural light comes through windows that have no bars. Now, before you throw your phone across the room, let me explain what you're not seeing. Those windows I just mentioned, they're deliberately designed so that when you look out, the only thing visible is the 20-foot concrete perimeter wall. You can't see trees. You can't see sky beyond that wall. You can't see freedom. The architects call this the wall paradox. The comfort of the room makes the barrier more psychologically acute. It's like being in a luxury hotel where the only view is a concrete reminder that you're never leaving. But let's be honest, that explanation doesn't satisfy the rage you're feeling right now, does it? And that's exactly what makes this story so important. Because Norway is asking a question that makes us deeply uncomfortable. They're asking, what is the purpose of prison? Is it punishment? Is it revenge? Is it protection? Or is it something else entirely? Here's the data that Norway keeps throwing in the world's face. Their recidivism rate, that's the percentage of people who commit crimes again after being released, is 20%. In the United States, it's 70%. In the UK, it's 48%. In Norway, only 1 in 5 people who go to prison end up back in prison within 5 years. In America, it's more than 2 out of 3. These aren't small differences. These are numbers that represent hundreds of thousands of lives, families, and communities. But here's the question nobody wants to ask. Does it work for everyone? Does it work for Anders Breivik? Does it work for people who commit crimes so heinous that rehabilitation seems not just impossible but obscene? Let me introduce you to someone who thinks about this every single day. His name is Halden. In 2026, he's one of the most controversial prison directors in the world. He runs Halden Prison, which is often called the most humane prison on earth. It's also the prison that many people call a luxury resort. Halden has a philosophy that sounds insane when you first hear it. He says, the punishment is the restriction of liberty. Nothing else. What does that mean in practice? It means that when you walk into Halden Prison, you don't see bars. You see walls made of brick and galvanized steel that look more like a college dormitory than a correctional facility. The cells have flat-screen TVs, mini-fridges, and private bathrooms with ceramic tiles. There's a recording studio where inmates can make music. There's a library that would make most small towns jealous. There's a kitchen where inmates cook meals together with guards. Wait, did I just say inmates cook with guards? Yes. And this is where we get to the first deep secret of the Norwegian system, the thing that changes how you understand everything else. It's called dynamic security, and it's based on a psychological principle that's both brilliant and deeply unsettling. In American prisons, there's a clear line between guards and inmates. Guards wear uniforms. They carry weapons. They maintain distance. The relationship is adversarial by design. It's us versus them, authority versus criminal. But Norwegian guards, they wear casual clothes that look more like business casual than corrections uniforms. Many of them don't carry weapons while on the cell blocks. And here's the part that sounds crazy, they're required by law to interact socially with inmates. They eat meals together. They play sports together. They have conversations about life, families, and feelings. The American mind hears this and thinks, that's insane. That's dangerous. That's disrespecting the victims. But the Norwegian system has a different calculation. They're not trying to be friends with criminals. They're trying to create a surveillance network so sophisticated that it doesn't look like surveillance at all. When a guard sits down to dinner with an inmate, they're not being kind. They're gathering intelligence. They're reading micro-expressions, noting changes in behavior, sensing when something is about to go wrong. The Norwegians call this normalization. They believe that if you treat people like animals, they behave like animals. If you treat them like humans, even humans who have done terrible things, you can sometimes reach the part of their brain that still responds to social norms and expectations. It's not about being nice. It's about creating an environment where rehabilitation is psychologically possible. But let's test this theory against the hardest case. Let's talk about what this looks like for Anders Breivik. In 2016, Breivik sued the Norwegian government. He claimed that his treatment in prison violated the European Convention on Human Rights. Specifically, he argued that his isolation, even in his 3-room unit with a TV and exercise equipment, constituted inhuman treatment. He said he was suffering. He said he was being psychologically tortured. Let that sink in for a moment. A man who killed 77 people, who showed no remorse, who gave Nazi salutes in court, was arguing that his comfortable prison cell was a violation of his human rights. The Norwegian court initially ruled in his favor. They said that some aspects of his isolation did violate human rights standards. The government appealed, and in 2017, that decision was overturned. But the fact that it happened at all sent shockwaves around the world. Americans looked at this and saw insanity. How could a mass murderer claim victimhood? How could a court even entertain the idea? But here's what the Norwegian system was actually doing, and this is crucial to understand. They were saying that human rights are not conditional. They're not rewards for good behavior. They exist even for the worst among us, because the moment we say some people are beneath human rights, we've created a door that can be opened wider and wider until it swallows people we never intended it to touch. This is the fracture. This is the moment where two completely different philosophies of justice crash into each other. On one side, there's the belief that some crimes are so evil that the perpetrator forfeits their claim to humanity. They deserve suffering. They deserve to feel every day the weight of what they've done. On the other side, there's the belief that a justice system that tortures people, even monsters, corrupts the society that created it. That we don't build better communities by becoming more like the worst among us. So which side is right? Here's where I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. Both sides have data. Both sides have logic. Both sides have moral weight. And that's what makes this so psychologically fascinating. Let me show you what I mean. In 2024, a study was published by the Norwegian Institute of Criminology. They tracked 150 violent offenders who went through the Norwegian system over a 15-year period. These weren't petty criminals. These were people convicted of assault, armed robbery, and in some cases, murder. The study found that offenders who spent time in high-security luxury prisons like Halden had a 15% recidivism rate compared to 30% for those in traditional Norwegian prisons, which by American standards are still incredibly comfortable. But here's the other side of the data. Of the 150 offenders studied, 3 committed violent crimes after their release. One of those crimes was a murder. A person died because someone was given a second chance. When you're looking at statistics, that's a data point. When you're looking at a grieving family, that's a tragedy that maybe could have been prevented with a longer sentence or harsher conditions. This is the impossible math of justice. Do we accept 3 victims in exchange for saving 15 potential criminals from reoffending? Do we lock everyone up forever to ensure absolute safety, knowing that we're also imprisoning people who would have changed? There's no calculator that solves this equation. There's no algorithm that tells us the right answer. And then there's Anders Breivik, who exists outside all of these statistics because he's never getting out. In 2026, he's filed his 7th lawsuit demanding better conditions. He claims that being restricted to his 3-room unit is torture. He claims that his lack of contact with other prisoners is a violation of his rights. Norwegian courts continue to reject these claims, but they have to hear them. That's how their system works. Here's what his current life looks like. He wakes up in his bedroom around 7 a.m. He exercises in his personal gym for about 90 minutes. He spends several hours writing, mostly legal appeals and political manifestos that will never be published. He's allowed visits from his lawyer and from a handful of approved contacts, though most of his family has disowned him. He watches television, though his access to news is limited. He eats 3 meals a day, which he sometimes prepares himself in a small kitchenette under supervision. To an American audience, this sounds like a vacation. To the families of his victims, this sounds like mockery. But to the Norwegian psychologists monitoring him, this is something else entirely. This is a man living in what they call luxurious isolation. He has physical comfort, but he's completely cut off from the thing humans need most: genuine human connection. He interacts with guards who are trained to be professionally cordial but emotionally distant. He has no friends. He has no community. He has no purpose beyond his failed legal battles. Dr. Randi Rosenqvist, one of the psychiatrists who evaluated Breivik, said something in a 2023 interview that stayed with me. She said, "People think we're giving him a good life. We're not. We're giving him a life that looks good from the outside but feels empty from the inside. That's its own kind of punishment." Is she right? Is psychological isolation in a comfortable cage worse than physical discomfort in a traditional prison? Here's the honest answer: we don't know. We don't have long-term studies on what this does to the human mind over decades. We're watching the experiment in real time. But I want to zoom out for a moment and ask a bigger question. Why does Norway do this? Why do they spend $125,000 per prisoner per year when they could build cheaper prisons and lock people in concrete boxes? The answer isn't what you think. Norway's population is about 5.5 million people. That's smaller than the population of Minnesota. It's a wealthy country with oil revenues that give them economic flexibility most nations don't have. But more importantly, it's a country with a deep cultural belief in collective responsibility. When someone commits a crime in Norway, the society asks, what did we miss? What support system failed? What could we have done differently? This sounds naive to American ears because we have a different cultural story. We believe in individual responsibility. We believe that people make choices and must face the consequences. Both worldviews have truth in them. Both worldviews have blind spots. Here's what happened in 2022 that made me rethink everything. A Norwegian criminologist named Thomas Ugelvik published a study where he interviewed 40 guards working in Norway's high-security prisons. He asked them a simple question: do you think what you're doing works? The results were startling. 85% of guards said they believed the Norwegian model reduced overall crime and made society safer. But when asked, do you think it works for everyone? That number dropped to 32%. The guards themselves, the people implementing the system every day, don't believe it's a universal solution. They identified a category of offender they called ideological criminals. These are people who commit crimes not out of desperation, mental illness, or social dysfunction, but out of deeply held beliefs. Anders Breivik is the poster child for this category. He doesn't need job training. He doesn't need addiction treatment. He doesn't need therapy for childhood trauma. He committed his crimes because he believed in them. He still believes in them. And no amount of comfortable living is going to change his ideology. So what do you do with someone like that? The Norwegian answer is the forvaring system, preventative detention. Here's how it works. After Breivik's initial 21-year sentence, the state can extend his imprisonment by 5 years at a time, indefinitely, if he's deemed a continued threat to society. In practice, this means Breivik will never be released. He will die in prison. But the Norwegian system can't say that explicitly because it violates their philosophical framework. They don't have life without parole on the books. They just have a system that achieves the same result through bureaucratic extension. Is this dishonest? Is this the Norwegians trying to have it both ways, claiming to be humane while still keeping monsters locked up forever? Or is it a pragmatic compromise that allows them to maintain their principles while protecting public safety? Again, there's no clean answer. Here's what I know. In February 2026, Anders Breivik had his latest appeal for release denied. The court ruled that he still poses a significant threat to public safety. He'll be eligible for another review in 2031. If he lives to be 80 years old, he'll have gone through about 15 of these reviews. And unless something dramatic changes, the answer will be the same every time: denied. So let me ask you the question that's been building this entire time. Is Anders Breivik being punished? If punishment means physical suffering, the answer is probably no. If punishment means loss of freedom, the answer is absolutely yes. If punishment means psychological isolation despite physical comfort, the answer might be yes in ways we're only beginning to understand. And here's the question that should trigger every comment section argument on this video. If you could design a justice system from scratch, what would it look like? Would you prioritize revenge or rehabilitation? Would you build prisons that inflict suffering or prisons that try to heal? Would you accept a higher recidivism rate if it meant punishing criminals more harshly? Or would you accept letting some monsters live comfortably if it meant saving more victims in the long run? There's no right answer to that question. But the fact that we're asking it, the fact that Norway is forcing the world to ask it, that might be the most important thing happening in criminal justice right now. Now that we understand what Norwegian prisons look like on the surface, we need to go deeper. Because the real story isn't about comfortable furniture or nice windows. The real story is about a psychological system so sophisticated that most people don't even realize they're inside it until years later. Let me introduce you to a concept that will change how you see everything. It's called dynamic security, and it's the secret weapon of the Norwegian correctional system. On paper, it sounds harmless. Guards are trained to build relationships with inmates. They're taught to use communication and observation instead of force and intimidation. But when you understand what's actually happening, you realize this is one of the most advanced surveillance systems ever created, and it doesn't require a single camera. Think about traditional prison security. In the United States, we use what's called static security. That means physical barriers, steel bars, concrete walls, armed guards in towers, metal detectors, body scanners. The assumption is that inmates are always looking for ways to escape or cause harm, so you need physical systems to prevent them. It's a chess game where both sides know the rules, and both sides are constantly trying to outsmart each other. Norwegian dynamic security works completely differently. Instead of preventing behavior through barriers, they predict behavior through relationships. Here's how it works in practice. A guard named Christian, let's call him that, works at Halden prison. He's been there for 8 years. Every morning, he eats breakfast in the communal dining area with the inmates on his unit. Not nearby, not watching from a distance. He sits at the same table. He passes the salt. He asks about their weekend, their families, their plans for the day. To an outsider, this looks like friendship. To Christian, this is intelligence gathering at the highest level. He's not just making small talk. He's establishing a behavioral baseline for every single person in that room. He knows that Johan usually makes jokes during breakfast. He knows that Marcus is quiet but always asks about Christian's kids. He knows that Anders, not Breivik but another inmate, always sits in the same chair and eats the same thing. Now here's where it gets brilliant. One Tuesday morning, Johan doesn't make jokes. Marcus doesn't ask about the kids. Anders sits in a different chair. To anyone else, these are meaningless variations. To Christian, these are red flags. Something has shifted in the social dynamics of the unit. There's tension. There's planning. Something is about to happen. Christian doesn't sound an alarm. He doesn't call for backup. He simply adjusts his own behavior. He spends more time in the common areas. He has a few more casual conversations. He listens for patterns in the things people aren't saying. And usually within 24 to 48 hours, he figures out what's going on. Maybe there's a conflict over a gambling debt. Maybe someone's about to receive bad news from home and the other inmates sense he's becoming unstable. Maybe there's a planned confrontation that hasn't happened yet. This is dynamic security. It's not about preventing violence through force. It's about detecting the psychological precursors to violence and intervening before anything physical happens. And the data shows it works. Halden Prison, the so-called luxury resort, has one of the lowest rates of inmate violence in the world. Not because inmates are locked in cells 23 hours a day. Not because guards carry weapons. But because the guards know their inmates so well that they can sense trouble before it starts. But here's the question nobody asks. What does this feel like from the inside? What's it like to be an inmate in a system where your guards are trained to be your friends, your therapists, your surveillance network, all at the same time? I want you to imagine something. You're in prison. You've done something terrible. You're carrying guilt, shame, anger, all of it. And then a guard sits down next to you at lunch and asks how you're doing. Really asks. Makes eye contact. Remembers details from your last conversation. For a moment you feel seen. You feel human. And then you remember, this person is paid to watch you. Every word you say is being analyzed. Every emotion you show is being cataloged. That kindness you're receiving? It's a tool. It's a method. It's surveillance wearing the mask of compassion. This is what the Norwegians call the paradox of normalization. They create an environment that feels more human than a traditional prison. But that humanity is itself a form of control. It's gentler than bars and chains, but in some ways it's more absolute. You can't escape a relationship the way you can plot to escape a locked cell. You can't fight against kindness the way you can fight against cruelty. Let me show you how deep this goes. In 2019, a psychologist named Mette Krukko published a study where she interviewed 60 inmates from Norwegian high-security prisons. She asked them a simple question: do you trust the guards? 78% said yes. Then she asked a follow-up question: do you think the guards are watching you when they seem friendly? 91% said yes. The inmates aren't fooled. They know exactly what's happening. And yet, the system still works because humans are fundamentally social creatures. Even when we know we're being manipulated, we still respond to genuine human interaction. But let's test this system against the hardest case again. Let's talk about what dynamic security looks like when the inmate is Anders Breivik. Breivik exists in a special category. He's in what's called high-security isolation. That means he doesn't eat breakfast with other inmates. He doesn't play sports with guards. He doesn't participate in the social ecosystem that makes dynamic security work. So how do the Norwegians handle him? They've created what I call the observation theater. Breivik has a team of guards who rotate through 12-hour shifts. These guards are specially trained, not just in corrections but in psychology, de-escalation, and something the Norwegians call threat assessment through micro-expressions. Every interaction Breivik has, even something as simple as asking for extra paper or complaining about the temperature, is documented and analyzed. The guards don't interrogate him. They don't press him for information. They simply observe. How does he respond to minor frustrations? Does he maintain eye contact? What topics make him animated versus withdrawn? Is his sleep pattern changing? Is his writing becoming more erratic? These observations go into weekly reports that are reviewed by psychiatrists, security analysts, and legal experts. This is surveillance that goes beyond anything most Americans would tolerate. But here's the twist: it's all considered part of his human rights protection. The argument is that by monitoring him this closely, they can ensure his mental health doesn't deteriorate to the point where his isolation becomes inhumane. They're not watching him to punish him. They're watching him to prove they're not punishing him too much. Does your brain hurt yet? Because mine does. We're looking at a system that uses intensive observation to guarantee humane treatment for a man who showed no humanity to 77 people. It's logically consistent and morally bewildering at the same time. Now let me show you the second deep secret of the Norwegian system. Remember those windows with no bars that I mentioned earlier? Let me explain the architecture of stress, because this is where Norwegian prison design becomes genuinely sinister in its sophistication. The architects who designed Halden prison weren't trying to make inmates comfortable. They were trying to make them psychologically stable enough to be rehabilitated. But in doing so, they created something that might be worse than traditional punishment. They created what environmental psychologists call cognitive dissonance spaces. Here's how it works. You're in a cell that looks like a college dorm room. Natural light. Modern furniture. Decent bed. Your brain sees these cues and says, this is a safe space. This is home. But then you look out the window and the only thing you can see is a 20-foot concrete wall. No trees. No sky beyond the barrier. No horizon. Just wall. Your brain now has contradictory information. The room says freedom. The view says captivity. This creates a constant low-level psychological stress that most inmates don't even consciously recognize. Studies done at Halden between 2015 and 2023 showed that inmates reported feeling more trapped in comfortable cells with wall-view windows than in traditional barred cells where they could at least see the sky. Why? Because in a traditional cell, there's no confusion about where you are. You're in a cage. You're being punished. Your environment matches your circumstance. But in Halden, you're living in a place that looks free but feels imprisoned. It's like being in a luxury hotel where all the doors are locked and you can never check out. The comfort makes the confinement more psychologically acute. The Norwegian architects will tell you this wasn't intentional malice. They'll say the windows were designed that way for security reasons. The wall had to be visible from certain angles to prevent blind spots. But whether it was intentional or not, the result is the same. They've created an environment where the punishment isn't physical suffering. It's existential confusion. And here's where it gets even more complex. Some inmates prefer this. A prisoner named Eric, serving 15 years for armed robbery, was interviewed in 2024. He said something that stuck with me. In my old prison, I was angry every day. Angry at the bars, angry at the guards, angry at the food. Here, I have nothing to be angry at except myself. And that's so much harder. This is the stated goal of the Norwegian system. They want inmates to confront themselves rather than their circumstances. They remove all the external things you can blame so that you're forced to face the internal things that led you to prison. It's therapeutic in theory. But in practice, it can be devastating. Let me show you what this looks like in numbers. The Norwegian Correctional Service tracks something called adjustment disorders among inmates. These are psychological conditions that develop as a response to environmental stress. In traditional Norwegian prisons, about 22% of inmates develop adjustment disorders within their first year. In the high-comfort prisons like Halden and Bastøy, that number is 31%. The nicer the prison, the harder the psychological adjustment. Why? Because removing external enemies forces people to face internal demons. And for many people, those demons are worse than any physical punishment. Now let's talk about the third deep secret, the one that changes everything. The forvaring system. The preventative detention loophole. This is how Norway maintains its image as a humane justice system while still keeping dangerous people locked up forever. Here's the official framework. Norway's maximum sentence is 21 years, even for the worst crimes. But for offenders deemed to pose a continued and serious threat to public safety, the court can impose forvaring, preventative detention. This starts at 21 years but can be extended by 5-year increments indefinitely. Every 5 years there's a review. The court examines new psychiatric evaluations, behavioral reports, and threat assessments. If the offender is still considered dangerous, the detention continues. In practice, this means Norway has life sentences without calling them life sentences. As of February 2026, there are 37 people in Norway serving forvaring sentences. Of those, 23 have been in the system for more than 21 years. The longest has been in preventative detention for 34 years. That person will likely die in prison. But Norway can still claim they don't have life sentences because, technically, each 5-year extension is a separate decision. This is brilliant and dishonest at the same time. It allows Norway to maintain its philosophical principles while protecting public safety. But it also creates a psychological torture that traditional life sentences don't have. Because every 5 years there's hope. Every 5 years there's a review. Every 5 years you might get out. But you never do. Imagine living like that. Imagine knowing that in 2031, there will be a hearing that could grant you freedom. You spend 5 years being a model prisoner. You take every therapy session seriously. You participate in every program. You show remorse. You demonstrate change. And then the hearing happens and 3 psychiatrists testify that while you've made progress, you still represent a threat. 5 more years. See you in 2036. How many cycles of hope and disappointment can a human psyche endure before it breaks? The Norwegian system doesn't know yet because they're still running the experiment. Anders Breivik is the most famous person in this system, but he's not alone. There's a man named Arnfinn Neset, a former nurse who killed at least 22 patients in the 1980s by injecting them with a muscle relaxant. He was sentenced to 21 years. When that sentence ended in 2004, he was transferred to forvaring. As of 2026, he's still in preventative detention. He's 95 years old. He'll die in prison. But technically he could be released at any time if he's deemed safe. There's also Varg Vikernes, a black metal musician who killed a rival musician in 1993 and burned several churches. He was sentenced to 21 years. Released in 2009 after serving 16 years. He was not placed in forvaring because psychiatrists determined he was no longer a threat. Today he lives in France, makes YouTube videos about Norse paganism, and has never reoffended. This is the Norwegian system working exactly as designed. Rehabilitation happened. He was released. Society is safer because he's not radicalized in a brutal prison. But the question everyone asks, would you want Varg Vikernes living next door to you? Would you send your kids to a school where a former church-burning murderer drops off his children? This is where the philosophy crashes into reality. Let me show you something that happened in 2023 that made international headlines. A man named Jan Helge Andersen was released from prison after serving 18 years for a particularly brutal assault. The Norwegian system had determined he was rehabilitated. 3 months after his release, he assaulted another person. Not fatally but violently. The victim's lawyer asked the question that haunts every restorative justice system. Who's responsible for this? The system that released him? The psychiatrist who evaluated him? Or just him? The Norwegian courts ruled that it was Andersen's responsibility alone. The system had followed its procedures. The evaluation was thorough. But prediction is not prevention. You cannot know with certainty what someone will do in the future. All you can do is make educated assessments and accept that sometimes you'll be wrong. But accepting that you'll be wrong means accepting that some people will be hurt who could have been protected. How do you weigh one person's rehabilitation against another person's safety? This is the math that keeps criminologists awake at night. Let me bring this back to Breivik because his case crystallizes all of these tensions. In February 2026, he filed his 7th lawsuit. This time, he's arguing that the forvaring system itself is a human rights violation because it creates indefinite uncertainty about his future. His lawyers claim that never knowing if or when he'll be released constitutes psychological torture. Here's the disturbing part, they might be right. The European Court of Human Rights has ruled in other cases that indefinite detention, even under comfortable conditions, can violate human dignity. But if Norway releases Breivik or even acknowledges that his detention might be indefinite, they undermine the entire philosophical foundation of their justice system. So they're stuck. They can't release him because he's an ongoing threat. They can't admit his sentence is actually life without parole because that violates their principles. So they continue the 5-year review cycle, knowing that every review will result in extension, pretending there's hope when there isn't. This is the shadow of Norwegian justice. It's a system built on beautiful principles that sometimes requires ugly compromises. It's a system that saves some people and potentially endangers others. It's a system that works brilliantly for most offenders and creates existential nightmares for the worst ones. Now let me show you what the guards think about all of this. Because the people implementing the system every day have a perspective that politicians and philosophers often miss. In 2025, a researcher named Helene Bakken interviewed 50 guards working in Norwegian maximum security prisons. She asked them, "Do you believe in the system you're working in?" Every single one said yes. Then she asked, "Has the system ever put you in a situation where your safety and your job requirements conflicted?" 68% said yes. Here's what they meant. Dynamic security requires guards to build relationships with inmates. But relationships require vulnerability. You can't connect with someone while maintaining complete emotional distance. So guards in the Norwegian system are taught to be authentically human with people who have committed inhuman acts. And sometimes that puts them at risk. One guard, whose name was withheld, described an incident where he'd been playing chess twice a week with an inmate for 6 months. They talked about books, philosophy, family. The guard thought they'd built genuine trust. Then one day the inmate attacked another inmate with an improvised weapon. When the guard intervened, the inmate he'd been playing chess with looked at him and said, "Sorry. This isn't personal." The violence wasn't directed at the guard, but the betrayal of trust was devastating. This is what the system asks of Norwegian corrections officers. Be human. Build relationships. Care about the people in your care. But also remember that some of those people are capable of extreme violence. Hold both truths simultaneously and don't let the contradiction break you. How sustainable is that? The same study found that Norwegian prison guards have a burnout rate of 34% after 10 years, compared to 18% in traditional Scandinavian prisons and 41% in American maximum security prisons. They're right in the middle, caught between two philosophies. Let me share one more piece of data that will help you understand the complexity here. In 2024, the Norwegian government commissioned a comprehensive study on the economic cost of their prison system versus the economic benefit. They wanted to know, is spending $125,000 per prisoner actually worth it? The results were striking. For every 100 offenders who go through the Norwegian system, approximately 20 will reoffend. For every 100 offenders who go through a traditional punitive system, approximately 70 will reoffend. If each reoffense costs society an average of $50,000 in police resources, court costs, victim support, and incarceration, the math looks like this. Norwegian system 20 reoffenders times $50,000 equals $1 million in social cost per 100 offenders. Traditional system 70 reoffenders times $50,000 equals $3.5 million in social cost. The Norwegian system costs more per prisoner but saves more in prevented crime. Economically, it's a bargain. But economics don't capture everything. They don't capture the 3 people who were hurt by the 20 who reoffended. They don't capture the rage of victims' families watching killers live in comfort. They don't capture the moral weight of treating monsters with dignity. So here's the question that should set your comment section on fire. Is justice about mathematics or morality? Should we design systems based on what works statistically or what feels right emotionally? Can a system be both effective and satisfying? Or do we have to choose? There's no algorithm that solves this. There's no study that gives us the answer. This is a question about values, and values can't be proven. They can only be chosen. We've seen the luxury. We've seen the system. Now we need to talk about the thing that nobody wants to discuss. The scar. Not the physical scars, though those exist. I'm talking about the psychological scars that this entire experiment leaves on everyone it touches. The inmates, the guards, the victims' families, and maybe most importantly, the society that has to live with the consequences of its own principles. Let me start with someone you haven't met yet. Her name is Lisbeth Roynland. On July 22, 2011, her 18-year-old daughter was on Utoya Island. Her daughter's name was Sin. Sin loved politics. She loved debate. She believed in making the world better through democratic participation. That's why she was at that youth camp. And that's why, at 6:47 p.m. on that summer afternoon, she was shot 3 times by Anders Breivik while trying to help a younger girl hide behind a rock. Sin survived. The younger girl didn't. And for the past 15 years, Lisbeth has been living in a country that's asking her to accept something that feels impossible. They're asking her to believe that the man who tried to kill her daughter, who succeeded in killing 77 others, deserves humane treatment. They're asking her to trust that rehabilitation is more important than revenge. They're asking her to have faith in a system that prioritizes the rights of criminals over the emotional needs of victims. In 2024, Lisbeth gave an interview to a Norwegian documentary filmmaker. She said something that broke my heart. She said, "I understand the philosophy. I understand the statistics. I understand that Norway has lower crime because we treat prisoners humanely. I understand all of it intellectually. But when I close my eyes at night, I see my daughter's scars. And I imagine him in his comfortable cell. And I feel like my country has chosen him over her. This is the scar that the Norwegian system doesn't know how to heal. Because you can't rehabilitate away a mother's pain. You can't statistically justify the suffering of people who did nothing wrong. And you can't ask victims to be more evolved than their grief allows them to be. The Norwegian government knows this. They're not monsters. They're not ignoring victims. In fact, Norway has one of the most comprehensive victim support systems in the world. Victims and their families receive free therapy, legal advocacy, financial support for medical bills and lost wages. There's even a program where victims can request meetings with offenders, if both parties consent, to seek some form of closure or understanding. But here's what the data shows. Of the families affected by the July 22 attacks, less than 5% have taken advantage of the restorative justice meetings. Less than 5%. The vast majority want nothing to do with Breivik. They don't want his apology, which he's never offered anyway. They don't want understanding. They want him to suffer. And the Norwegian system, for all its sophistication, can't give them that without betraying its own principles. This creates a moral injury that runs deeper than any physical wound. The families of Breivik's victims are essentially being told that their desire for punishment is less important than society's commitment to rehabilitation. They're being told that their pain, while acknowledged, cannot be the foundation of justice. And that feels like betrayal. Let me show you how this plays out in a specific case. There's a man named Petter Sorli. His 14-year-old son was killed on Utoya. After the attack, Petter became a vocal critic of the Norwegian prison system. He didn't call for the death penalty. Norway doesn't have one. He didn't call for torture. He simply argued that Breivik should be kept in a traditional maximum security cell. No PlayStation. No kitchen. No gym. Just a bed, a toilet, and books. The absolute minimum required by international law. The Norwegian government rejected this proposal. They argued that creating different tiers of human rights based on the severity of crime would undermine the entire system. If Breivik gets harsher treatment because his crimes were worse, then you've created a precedent where rights are conditional. And conditional rights aren't rights at all. They're privileges that can be taken away. Petter Sorli's response was devastating. He said, "Then your system values theoretical principles more than actual people. My son was an actual person. The teenagers who died were actual people. Breivik's comfort is theoretical. But you've chosen theory over reality. Is he right?" From one perspective, absolutely. The Norwegian system is asking real people with real pain to sacrifice their emotional needs for an abstract principle. From another perspective, that's exactly what a justice system is supposed to do. It's supposed to be based on principles that transcend individual cases, because if we make policy based on our worst moments and our angriest feelings, we create systems that no one would want to live under during their best moments and their calmest thoughts. But let's be honest. That's a very easy thing to say when it's not your child who was murdered. Now let me show you the scar on the other side. The one that affects the people who work within the system. Because the Norwegian model doesn't just ask a lot of victims. It asks the impossible of the people who have to implement it every single day. Remember Christian, the guard I mentioned earlier? The one who eats breakfast with inmates and builds relationships as part of dynamic security? In 2023 he left his job at Halden prison. He'd been there for 11 years. He was considered one of the best guards in the system. And he quit because he couldn't carry the weight anymore. In his exit interview, which was later shared anonymously with researchers, he described what he called the empathy trap. He said, "You're trained to see inmates as human beings. You're trained to care about their rehabilitation. You're trained to build real relationships. And then you go home and you read the case files and you remember what they actually did. And you can't reconcile the person you had lunch with and the person who committed that crime. It's like trying to hold two opposite truths in your head at the same time. Eventually, something breaks. This is what the Norwegian system demands of its correctional officers. Be human enough to connect. Be professional enough to maintain boundaries. Be compassionate enough to believe in rehabilitation. Be realistic enough to remember that some people are extremely dangerous. Hold all of these contradictions simultaneously. Don't let the cognitive dissonance destroy you. A 2025 study by the Norwegian Institute of Occupational Health found that guards in high-comfort prisons had significantly higher rates of what they called moral injury compared to guards in traditional prisons. Moral injury is what happens when you're required to do something or witness something that violates your core values. It's different from trauma. Trauma is what happens when you're hurt. Moral injury is what happens when you're forced to betray yourself. Guards in the Norwegian system experience moral injury because they're asked to treat people kindly who have committed unkind acts. They're asked to advocate for the well-being of people who showed no regard for others' well-being. They're asked to maintain faith in humanity while working with people who represent humanity's worst failures. And the system offers them therapy. It offers them support groups. It offers them time off and mental health resources. But it can't change the fundamental contradiction at the heart of their job. You can't make it psychologically comfortable to be the compassionate guardian of monsters. Let me tell you about what happened to one of the guards who worked directly with Anders Breivik. I can't use his real name. The Norwegian government protects the identity of guards who work in high-security units. So let's call him Thomas. Thomas was part of the rotating team that supervised Breivik from 2013 to 2018. 5 years. During that time, Thomas had thousands of interactions with Breivik. Brief conversations. Meal deliveries. Escorting him to and from his exercise room. Responding to his requests for supplies. In 2019, Thomas had a breakdown. Not a minor one. A complete psychological collapse that required 6 months of intensive therapy and medical leave. When he was finally able to talk about it, he described the experience like this. I started having dreams where I was the one on Utoya. I would see the island and I would see the children running and I would see myself with the gun. Not Breivik. Me. My brain couldn't separate myself from him anymore because I'd spent so much time treating him like a normal person. I'd normalized a monster, and in doing so, I'd put some of that monster inside myself. This is an extreme case, but it illustrates a truth that the Norwegian system is still learning to address. You cannot ask people to maintain deep empathy for perpetrators of extreme violence without that empathy leaving a mark. Some guards can handle it, some can't. And the system doesn't have a good way of predicting who will break until they're already broken. Now let's talk about the scar on the inmates themselves. Not Breivik will come back to him, but the regular prisoners. The people who committed serious crimes but might actually be rehabilitated. What does the Norwegian system do to them psychologically? In 2022, a sociologist named Kjetil Andersen conducted a longitudinal study following 40 inmates through their entire sentence at Halden prison and for 5 years after release. The results were complicated. Of the 40, 34 did not reoffend. That's an 85% success rate, which is extraordinary. But when Andersen dug into the psychological data, he found something disturbing. Many of the former inmates reported feeling what they called phantom guilt. This is different from normal guilt about their crimes. Phantom guilt is the feeling that they didn't suffer enough, that they got away with something, that their punishment was too comfortable to balance the scales of what they'd done. One former inmate, a man who served 8 years for vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, described it like this: I killed someone. A 22-year-old woman. She had her whole life ahead of her. And my punishment was living in a place nicer than some apartments I'd had as a free man. I got therapy. I got education. I got job training. I got a second chance. And I'm grateful. But I also feel like I cheated the universe somehow. Like I owe a debt I never actually paid. This is the unintended consequence of humane punishment. Some people need to suffer to feel like they've atoned. The Norwegian system denies them that suffering. And for some inmates, that denial creates a psychological burden that follows them for life. They can't forgive themselves because they feel like they were never properly punished. Is this a problem the system should solve? Should Norway make prisons harsher just so inmates can feel like they've suffered enough? That seems absurd. But the psychological reality remains. Some people cannot heal without first feeling like they've been adequately hurt. And then there's Anders Breivik himself. What is this system doing to him? We know what it's doing for victims and guards and other inmates. But what about the man at the center of this entire controversy? Based on psychiatric evaluations conducted every year since his imprisonment, here's what we know. Breivik shows no remorse. He maintains his ideological beliefs. He continues to view himself as a political prisoner rather than a criminal. He spends his time writing manifestos that will never be published, filing lawsuits that will never succeed, and maintaining a worldview that is completely disconnected from reality as most people understand it. In other words, the Norwegian system has failed completely in his case if the goal is rehabilitation. He's not being rehabilitated. He's being warehoused. In comfort, yes. With dignity, supposedly. But warehoused nonetheless. But here's the question that will haunt Norwegian criminology for decades. Is the failure because the system doesn't work for ideological extremists? Or is the failure because true rehabilitation for someone like Breivik would require him to fully comprehend the magnitude of what he's done, and if he did that, the psychological weight would destroy him? Dr. Randi Rosenqvist, the psychiatrist who's evaluated Breivik multiple times, said something chilling in a 2025 interview. She said, if Anders Breivik ever truly understood what he did, if he ever truly felt the weight of 77 lives, he would have to kill himself. The human psyche cannot carry that much guilt and survive. So in a sense, his lack of remorse is a psychological defense mechanism. It's the only thing keeping him alive. If that's true, then the Norwegian system is stuck in an impossible position. They can't rehabilitate him without breaking him. They can't punish him harshly without betraying their principles. They can't release him without endangering society. They can't keep him forever without admitting that rehabilitation has limits. So they do what they've been doing. They keep him in his 3-room unit. They monitor him constantly. They deny his lawsuits. They extend his preventative detention every 5 years. And they wait. For what? For him to die? For society to change? For some new framework to emerge that solves the unsolvable? Let me show you what the future looks like because we're already in it. In 2025, the Norwegian government announced a new initiative they're calling adaptive justice. The idea is to maintain the humane prison conditions but add a new layer of consequence for offenders who show no progress toward rehabilitation. Here's how it works. Every prisoner gets a baseline level of comfort and dignity. That never changes. But additional privileges, things like access to education programs, vocational training, family visits beyond the minimum, are now tied to demonstrated progress in therapy and behavioral metrics. If you're actively working on rehabilitation, you get more opportunities. If you're resistant, you get less. Critics immediately called this a betrayal of the Norwegian model. They argued that making privileges conditional creates a two-tier system. Supporters argued that it's a necessary evolution. That unlimited access to rehabilitation resources for people who refuse to engage is wasteful and demoralizing to victims. The debate is ongoing. And it's a perfect example of how even Norway, the global leader in humane incarceration, is struggling with the limits of its own philosophy. But let me zoom out and show you the biggest scar of all. The one on Norwegian society itself. Because here's what 40 years of this experiment has created. A country that's safer than most, with lower crime rates and lower recidivism. But also a country where victims feel abandoned by their own justice system. A country where guards burn out trying to reconcile contradictions. A country where even successful rehabilitation comes with psychological costs no one anticipated. And most troubling of all, a country that's slowly realizing that some crimes might be beyond the scope of any system designed by humans. That there might be a category of offender for whom neither punishment nor rehabilitation makes sense. For whom the only honest answer is, we don't know what to do with you, so we're going to keep you here in comfort and isolation until you die. That's not a triumph of enlightened policy. That's an admission of limitation disguised as principle. So here's the final question, the one that should generate 1,000 comments and arguments. What do we owe the people who hurt us? Do we owe them nothing? Do we owe them proportional suffering? Do we owe them a chance at redemption? Or do we owe them something stranger and harder? The commitment to principles that transcend individual cases, even when those principles feel like betrayal. Norway has chosen the last option. They've decided that how they treat their worst citizens defines who they are as a society more than how those citizens behaved. They've decided that maintaining humanity in the face of inhumanity is worth the emotional cost to victims, the psychological toll on guards, and the moral complexity that comes with treating monsters like people. Are they right? I honestly don't know. But I know this, they're asking the question. They're running the experiment. They're living with the consequences. And the rest of the world is watching, trying to decide if this is the future of justice or a cautionary tale about the limits of compassion. In February 2026, Lisbeth Roynland, the mother I told you about earlier, gave another interview. The journalist asked her if she still believes the Norwegian system is wrong. She paused for a long time. Then she said, I believe my daughter would have supported it. She believed in rehabilitation. She believed in second chances. She believed in the power of education and therapy to change people. If I demand revenge in her name, I'm betraying everything she stood for. But if I accept this system, I'm betraying my own heart. So I live in that contradiction. Just like Norway does. Just like everyone involved in this impossible situation does. That's the scar. Not the one that heals. The one you learn to carry. So where does this leave us? We've traveled through the most expensive, most controversial prison system on earth. We've seen the luxury that makes your blood boil. We've seen the psychology that makes you question everything. We've seen the scars that never heal. And here's what I want you to understand. This isn't really a story about Norway. This is a story about all of us. Because every single person watching this video right now has to answer the same question that Norway is wrestling with. What do we do with the people who hurt us? Do we hurt them back? There's an honest logic to that. An eye for an eye. Make them feel what they made others feel. There's a primal satisfaction in that answer. But history shows us where that road leads. Brutalized prisoners become more brutal. Dehumanized people lose their last connection to humanity. And societies that torture their criminals eventually turn that brutality on people who don't deserve it. Or do we try to fix them? Invest in rehabilitation. Bet on the possibility of change. Accept the risk that some will never change but believe that enough will to make it worth trying. That's what Norway has chosen. And the results are undeniable. Lower crime. Fewer victims. Safer communities. But it comes at a cost that statistics can't measure. The cost of asking victims to be more forgiving than anyone should have to be. Here's the truth that nobody wants to say out loud. There is no perfect answer. There is no justice system that satisfies everyone. There is no policy that balances safety, rehabilitation, punishment, and compassion in a way that feels right to every person it affects. Norway has made a choice. They've decided that the measure of a society is not how it treats its best citizens, but how it treats its worst. They've decided that maintaining their own humanity is more important than satisfying their desire for revenge. They've decided that the long-term reduction of suffering for future victims is worth the short-term emotional cost to current victims. Are they right? That's not a question I can answer for you. That's a question you have to answer for yourself. But I'll leave you with this. Anders Breivik will spend the rest of his life in that 3-room unit. He'll eat decent food. He'll exercise. He'll watch television. He'll write his manifestos that nobody reads. And he'll never, ever leave. He'll die there. Alone. Isolated. Surrounded by comfort but deprived of the one thing humans need most, genuine human connection. Is that justice? Is that punishment? Is that rehabilitation? Or is it just the best that imperfect humans can do when faced with perfect evil? The Norwegian experiment continues. The data keeps coming in. The debates keep raging. The victims keep grieving. The guards keep struggling. The inmates keep cycling through. And somewhere in a comfortable cell with a view of a concrete wall, the question remains unanswered. What do we owe the monsters? And more importantly, who do we become when we answer that question? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know. If you were designing a justice system from scratch, what would it look like? What would you do with someone like Anders Breivik? There's no wrong answer here because there's no right answer either. There's only the answer you can live with. And maybe that's the real lesson from Norway. Justice isn't about finding the perfect solution. It's about choosing which imperfect solution reflects the society you want to be. Thanks for watching. Thanks for thinking. And thanks for being willing to sit with questions that don't have easy answers. Until next time. Image prompts. 6 images at 20 seconds each equals 2 o'clock. Image 1, midnight to 0:20 globe or world map with Norway highlighted, connecting lines suggesting global attention. Dramatic overhead lighting. Heavily desaturated map background. Norway's highlighted area pops in muted red. Cinematic macro 35mm. Sharp focus on Norway, heavy bokeh showing rest of world. Film grain. Global relevance. Image 2, 0:20 to 0:40 smooth featureless mannequin Breivik, in gray sweater, seated alone in his cell. View from behind showing him looking at window with concrete wall visible beyond. Dramatic natural window lighting creating long shadows across floor. Heavily desaturated cell environment. Gray sweater pops subtly against concrete. Cinematic wide-angle 35mm. Sharp focus on figure, blurred wall through window. 15-foot depth. Moody lighting. Film grain. Permanent isolation. Image 3, 0:40 to 1 o'clock scales of justice balanced on desk. One side with books titled Rehabilitation. Other side with books titled Punishment, scales perfectly balanced in center. Dramatic desk lamp lighting from above. Heavily desaturated background. Gold scales pop against gray desk. Cinematic macro 35mm. Razor sharp focus on scales, heavy bokeh background. Film grain. Impossible equilibrium. Image 4, 1 to 120 multiple smooth featureless mannequins representing diverse people, various civilian clothing, different builds suggesting age/background diversity, standing in individual spotlights against dark background, each facing slightly different direction. Dramatic individual spotlighting on each figure. Heavily desaturated dark background. Each figure's clothing color pops in their spotlight. Cinematic wide-angle 35mm. Sharp focus on foreground figures, bokeh showing more in background. Film grain. Individual perspectives. Image 5, 120 to 140 close-up of concrete perimeter wall texture, weathered surface, small patches of moss, subtle cracks. No sky or ground visible, just wall filling entire frame. Dramatic overcast natural lighting. Heavily desaturated concrete grays and greens. Wall texture details pop. Cinematic macro 35mm. Razor sharp focus on wall texture, minimal bokeh. Film grain. Photorealistic concrete and moss. Barrier permanence. Image 6, 1:40 to 2 o'clock Norwegian flag waving in wind against dramatic sky. Sun breaking through clouds creating light rays. Dramatic natural backlighting. Heavily desaturated sky in grays and blues. Flags red and blue pop intensely against desaturated clouds. Cinematic wide-angle 35mm. Sharp focus on flag, blurred dramatic sky background. Film grain. Complex symbolism. What do you think? If you were in charge of creating a justice system, how would you handle someone like Anders Breivik? Drop your answer in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.